Well, welcome to the Aging Boomers. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, for most of you that have listened to our show before, we discuss so many of the issues facing not only boomers, but their parents, and what we know, of course, is an aging population, which I fall into that category for sure. I wanted to let you all know that today's show is sponsored by Senior Care Authority, a professional senior placement and elder care consulting organization that has a national network of advisors to help in determining the right path for senior living and receiving proper care. So whether it's in-home care, assisted living, residential or memory care, or you just need someone to help you with advocacy work, get the necessary advice from a senior care advisor right in your area by calling Senior Care Authority at 888-809-1231, or you could go directly to the website at www.seniorcareauthority.com. I want to thank you all for just listening in. So many of you have gone download the free app, which you can do on your iPhone or Android phone. Just type in the Aging Boomers, and you could get up to date on all the interviews. Of course, we're on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and many of the other sites on the internet as well. Or you could go directly to our website at theagingboomers.com. Also, thanks for your support on my recent book, called The Aging Boomers, which is a compilation of many of the great interviews that we did throughout the past couple years. Some great information in there. Speaking of books, I want to introduce our guest today, who is Robert Hall. He's a noted author, consultant, and speaker on relationships. His book is The Land of Strangers, the relationship crisis that imperils home, work, politics, and faith. As co-founder and CEO of an international relationship management firm, he consulted for over 20 years with major corporations on customer and employee relationships. Ernst and Young named him the finalist for Entrepreneur of the Year. He has authored more than 100 published columns, articles, and research studies on the topics of relationships. Robert helps us connect the dots on the larger narrative around our society-wide relationship crisis. He is also a regular contributor to the Huffington Post. Robert, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the Aging Boomers today.
Oh, what a pleasure. Great to be with you, Frank.
Yeah. I know I didn't mention it in the introduction, but you wrote a book also prior to this most recent one called The Street Corner Strategy for Winning Local Markets. And, you know, it was focused more on the manager or the executive, from more of a business perspective. So you kind of shifted gears a little bit on the second book. Tell us a little bit more kind of what led you in that direction.
Sure. Well, you know, first of all, for my number of years in business, I consider myself a recovering CEO. So for over 20 years, I was working in the business area, working with clients. And after I sold my company a little over 10 years ago, I started doing a lot of volunteer work with inner-city homeless families. And it's interesting, in business, I found that, relationships are really key to effective leadership, and they're really, really difficult. In working with inner-city homeless, what I found is that most often homelessness occurs not when someone loses their last dollar, but when they use up their last relationship. And so I saw, as in business where relationships were really crucial and declining, I saw in the homeless community how challenging relationships were and how it leads to poverty and a number of other things. So my takeaway from those two experiences is that broken relationships are really breaking us as a society. And so I spent 6 years really connecting the dots with the decline in relationships at home, what was going on in declining relationships at work, in the realm of politics, which we can all relate to in a presidential year, and then in the realm of faith or belief. And so I really connected the dot to say there's a cumulative effect. And I think when we look at boomers and those of us aging in that direction, I really believe that the wisdom of aging is that relationships are really important and maybe the most lasting thing that we have. So I think all of us as we get older naturally see that relationships are more important. But I also find as I speak around the country that a lot of us, particularly I'm a boomer, see the decline in relationships that's occurring in our society as one of our gravest concerns. And in fact, if you look at the data on relationships, what you find is, I was born in 1948, and so if you look at the time that many of us boomers were kind of coming on about in the mid-60s or 70s into adulthood, is when these trends of relationship decline begin to occur. So as boomers, we've lived through it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So it would be, I think, helpful if I were just to kind of net it all out, is we as boomers are both a part of what has occurred as the problem, and we're also very worried about it as a consequence.
You have some great statistics in your book, and you do discuss the decline of family relationships. Rise in divorce, decline in marriage, increase in children raised, in a single-parent family. So how do you see this affecting the care of the elderly in the coming years?
Well, it's interesting. Just to highlight a couple of those stats, there's something I call the rule of 50, and the rule of 50 is that in the last 50 years, we've seen that divorce has doubled. It's now about 50%. Marriage is down about 50%. And in the last year or so now, 50% of the kids born to mothers under 30 are born into single-parent households. So the relationship infrastructure of family is greatly declining. And by the way, for those kids born into single-parent households, the poverty rate is 5 times that of their counterparts. So as grandparents, as folks who now are seeing this unfold, it certainly impacts us in terms of the area of concern that we have for our kids and our grandkids. But the instability of those families also impact our care. It's really simple math. And I'm not here to throw stones at any of us. All of us have had our challenges, whether it's divorce or whatever. But the bottom line is, where 2 parents are present, that's twice as many as 1 parent. And so whether it's the care of the kids or whether it's the care of their parents, us, it means that the infrastructure is greatly decreased. And I would say, interesting, as I connected the dots, we also find that American Sociological Review did a study, and they found over the last 20 years the number of close go-to friends, someone you'd go to in a real bind with a problem, has decreased by a third, and that the number of people who say they have 0 close go-to friends has tripled. So if you think of relational infrastructure for those of us getting older, in friends, in family, and in community, it's a struggle. Now, it's interesting. It'd be one thing if we say, well, it just ends there in our family, but also at work. We find Gallup's recent research says 70% of people at work self-report they're disengaged. 35% of workers say they would forego a significant pay increase just to have their current boss removed. So the relationships at work, many of us are ending our work career, but the relationships at work, whether it's us or our kids or even our grandkids, is greatly declining. Then you look in the realm of politics, and in this election, I recently wrote a paper that's on Huffington Post, and we all know that when you look at disapproval of presidential candidates, 56% of the folks out there say they disapprove of Hillary Clinton. 65% say they disapprove of Donald Trump. And we find that the number of people who belong to political parties has the number that have defected from those has doubled in the last 50 years. So you look at home and you say, and community, that's in decline. You look at work, relationships, not as strong. You look in the realm of politics and government, not as strong. And then you look in the area of faith. This term's arisen called the knots, and the fact that the number of people not affiliated with a religious faith or organization has doubled in the last 18 years. So you net all that out, and it says increasingly we've become the not generation. We're either not married or no longer married and are not functioning as a parent. We're not employed or we're not connected to our employer. We're not a part of a political party, and we're not religiously affiliated. And so the net of all of that is that the places that we typically go for care, both relational care as well as actual physical care, all of those places, the relationship decline translates into less effective care, less productive relationships.
Yeah. You know, the statistics that we didn't talk about, which we talk about quite a bit on our show, is, you know, people are living longer. They're living longer because they're beating other diseases, cancer, heart disease, etc. But, you know, the longer you live, you got a better chance, unfortunately, to get some sort of cognitive impairment, like dementia, Alzheimer's. People are familiar with Alzheimer's. And yet people still, if you ask people, of course, they want to live at home the rest of their lives, but without having children, without having a spouse, you know, it's going to be tough for them to do that, wouldn't you say?
Well, it is, and it's one of the issues that I often get in the audiences that I speak to that talk about people our age said, when my parents or my parents' parents, when they became aged, when they became infirm, when they could no longer take care of themselves, they tended to move in with family members. And today, that's so often not the case, and there's a number of reasons for that. The family structure is less stable and more chaotic and not as strong. You look at just the styles of our culture today or such, but increasingly what we are having to do, and your example is a great one, is to make up for or fill in something to stand in the gap for what used to occur naturally. It falls in that category of relationships are our lifeline. It's interesting, Bill and Melinda Gates, have just almost more money than God, have basically said the most important healthcare system in the world is a mother. And what they have found with all the money they spent on nets and vaccine and so forth, that it is the relational piece that's crucial to then make their monetary gifts work. Well, what we're struggling today in the world of senior care and so forth is looking for productive relationships, whether that is assisted as we live at home or whether that is once we move into either nursing or assisted living or whatever kind of senior care, is we have to now be more intentional about how we find and fill the gap for productive relationships that allow all of us to be at our best.
Yeah, it was interesting. In Chapter 5, you talk about that the most important healthcare system in the world is a mother, and that's
exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting as we fill up the things. You can build brick and mortar, you can hire people, you can put those things in place, but the relational piece is perhaps the most important and least predictable thing that we can replicate as we try to acquire services, care, and support, particularly in the older years. So it's really crucial.
Yeah. So you also say in the book that care can only be delivered by someone who is in a relationship. So how might education, healthcare, and other social services be designed to deliver more relationship-centered care, would you say?
That's a great question, and I love how you worded it, because when you really say, how do we design for a relationship, what I find historically, if you look at the history of folks who built things, we looked at the efficiency design of facilities and layout and ease of use and ease of access and convenience and a whole series of things, all of which are very important. But often the engineers and the architects did not design for relationship. And what we're finding now is that increasingly, as people understand better what works and doesn't work, is the intention of stronger relationships has to translate into design. Let me just give you, one example. In the last 10 years, if you look at the total number of homes built in this country, there's been a 40% increase in the number of homes with a front porch. Why? Because with air conditioning and electronic garage door openers and fences and all of that, we learned how to shut the neighborhood out. And we find ourselves now often estranged, and we need a front porch whereby we can connect with our neighbors. Well, if you take the symbolic kind of nature of a front porch and you look at common areas, we're finding that increasingly people are trying to design their neighborhoods when they build a home, and this certainly applies to senior care or wherever we might wind up, is designing for relational connection that provides a way for people to interact, a way for people to get to know each other and develop relationships. So the convenience and the cost and the efficiency, all that still matters. But increasingly we're trying to design everything from physical layout to programs to lunch schedules, all of those different things in a way that builds and replicates strong relationships. And so I've written a couple of papers that delve into that issue of how do you design for a relationship, whether it's at home and whether your home is where you were living before you were a senior or senior care, or how do you design for a relationship at work? How do we redesign our political process so that it's not so incredibly anti-relational as it is now? And even the area of faith, belief, social clubs, those kinds of things, how do we design for that? And I find that when I look at what's really crucial as we become, many of us boomers and so forth, after we've retired, one of the biggest challenges, particularly for men, it's for both, who've worked all their lives, is how do they fill the void for the work relationships? Because men are often not quite as good at building personal relationships, and when they stop working, there's a huge void. And so part of the challenge is how do we design our recreational or retirement time in a way to build relationships that do not leave us so dependent on work relationships and at such loss when we come to retirement.
Yeah. So you mentioned a term earlier which I find very interesting. It's you say the not generation, all right?
Yeah.
And I noticed it, and I'm a boomer, and I noticed that more of my friends, many of them, not many, but more than I'm used to seeing, don't have children. And I'm also seeing my kids' generation, so many of their friends who have gotten married and have purposely, just their decision, decided not to have children.
Right.
I see that as it's interesting to me, all right, but at the same time, I concerned as far as their care when they get older. But why do you think it is? Is it because people, I don't want, because of like you talked about, the political climate, that I don't want to bring somebody into this world and into this crazy world? I mean, why do you think it is that more and more are not having children?
I think there's a couple of things that are at the top of that list. It's more than a couple of reasons. If you go back, I was born and raised out on a ranch, and I had two siblings. But the fact is, where we grew up, the kids did a lot of the work. So, as an agrarian society 50 to 100 years ago, kids were such an asset. In today's world, you look at the average cost to send a kid to college and so forth, and the math is pretty overwhelming. So economically, not only are there more families choosing not to have kids, but among those who do, smaller families. So I think clearly that's a part of it. I think there's another piece that we are a society that's become very much designed around convenience and entertainment. And children, you look at the research, the first 2 or 3 years that a family has a child, the parents get less sleep, they have more demands, the whole series of things. And so I think part of it is the short-term advantage of being a little more carefree has trumped the long-term advantage of maybe long-term having the great rewards of children. I have 2 children, and even the care that they provide in your older age. And I think the third thing is there was once a time, widows and orphans, if you lost your spouse or whatever, you just lived on the edge of poverty most often. Today, a number of people have the kinds of income and wealth that they say, I can purchase someone to support me and so forth. So I think there's a number of reasons for that, but it does go back to this larger question of what are we designing our lives for? And I think over and again, as we grow older, we realize that our relationships, if we live a normal life, we come to the conclusion that our relationships are the single most valuable thing that we have, number one. And number two, it is through our relationships with kids and grandkids and friends and so forth. That's as close as we get to eternal life here on earth, because the relationships we have and the influence we exert, maybe the learning that we provide in addition to that we receive, lives on through those that we have relationships with. Many of us can still remember phrases our parents said to us, 40, 50 years ago. So the relationships are one of the ways we extend ourselves beyond life on this earth as we know it. And so when that is removed and taken away, it means not only do we not have care, but our legacy changes some in terms of the influence we exert. And I think, when you're 20 or 30, 40, you don't think about that quite as much as you do. I'm 67. At 67, you think a little bit more about that, and all of that's in that realm of designing for what's really important in life.
So, knowing that our target audience on our show are the baby boomers, but certainly we're trying to help them not only in their own situation, but their parents and other loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
mm-hmm.
I know you talked about some already, but maybe you could expound upon any particular takeaway points for our listeners that you'd like to leave them with.
Sure. There's I boil this down to 3 Ps. It's more complicated than that, but I think there's 3 Ps that for us as baby boomers that are particularly relevant. And I think the first one is to really say and consciously live out an intention that says relationships are my number one priority. And whether it's with a spouse, a friend, a child, a grandchild, whether it's at the club, whether it's at church, wherever I'm at, in these years when we get into our age, we've learned a lot, and perhaps what we've learned that's more important than anything to society is what we've learned about making productive relationships that work for everyone. So I start out by saying, particularly as you think of retirement and so forth, maybe you just go ahead and make explicit what you're already feeling, and that is that my relationships are my number one priority. And some people say it's on the horizontal with friends and so forth. Some people say a relationship with my faith, but both vertically and horizontally to say those strong relationships are going to be really important. And if you were to say that relationships are my number one P, my priority, the question that comes behind that would be, then how would I live out that purpose? In my circumstance, how shall I go about doing that? And one of the great things about a lot of people in the baby boomer generation is they are figuring out their purpose, and maybe a lot of that is about how they're going to help others. And whether that is a grandchild, whether that is volunteering. It's interesting, my wife chairs the board of a volunteer organization here where I live in Dallas called Brian's House. And they take care of special needs kids. And they have a whole group of really foster grandparents who come every day or every other day and spend time with special needs kids. And these kids range anywhere from 3 or 4 to 6, 7, and 8. And so that's an example. They've determined their purpose can be basically activated by helping those kids. And we all know lots of people, whether it's raising money. I have a good friend who does PR work. She's doing that for a volunteer nonprofit organization. So really saying, how do I, in what I believe about whatever's important, how do I build a network of relationships where I'm living that out? And then the third P that I think is really important is power, and it is called really empower. And that is, if given the things that I know and given the things that I've learned, how can I, in my club, in my group, in my church, in where I volunteer, how can I really enable and empower others to build stronger relationships based on what I know? Now, not everybody's going around and asking us for advice all the time, but in relationship, when we get to know people, we rub off on them, they rub off on us. And if we were to say, I worry in this world that relationships are something that we're paying a very heavy price for. I've written a paper called The Disengagement Economy, where I talk about the hidden tax of broken relationships that affects everything from the amount of government services that are required because families don't have the kind of support and so forth. If we're concerned about that, take the area that we know, that we have passion around, that we're good at, and say, how can I work with others, not just to do work, but to build relationships where others are empowered and enabled to do work. And again, that may be volunteering, it may be anything, but to me, I say relationships. It's interesting, when I started on my book, one of the conclusions I came to is I said, I'm going to make relationships, that's going to be the primary focus for the rest of my life. Well, I've written a book on it, so not everybody's going to do that. But if we were to make it a priority, if we figure out what's the best purpose that carries out that priority, and then if not only in leading that, it's what I call relational leadership, but empowering and enabling others to build those productive relationships, networks of volunteers, wherever it is. To me, those would be the great examples. I'll give just one final example. There's something called NAMI. It's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they really help families who are really struggling with bipolar and special needs kids. And there's a lady that I know, she is 89, and she helps facilitate those sessions, and she's really good at it. And she's been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's just a great example. When we focus, no matter what our health, we say, whatever I'm challenged with, my primary focus is not going to be me, it's going to be someone and something bigger than I am. That is the best, most effective form of treatment we can give ourselves, is helping others. And so for me, when we look at where we are in our life today, how do we pass it forward? And often it will help others, but it'll be great mental and physical health additive for us.
Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the Aging Boomers. Please check out his book. It's called This Land of Strangers, The Relationship Crisis That Imperils Home, Work, Politics, and Faith. I know you can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Is that correct? That's correct. You can get it in hard form. You can get it in electronic form. It's available any of those ways. Great. And I know that you do speaking engagements, so maybe you could just share quickly how people could learn more about that as well.
Sure. If you're interested in that, or if you're interested in any of the papers that I've written, just go to my website, www.robertehall.com. Or you can go into Huffington Post and just search for Robert Hall author, and there'll be a list of things I've written there as well.
Great. Robert, thank you again for joining us on The Aging Boomers. We'll have to have you back in the future, maybe on book number 3, huh?
All right. Thank you so much, Frank.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you all for joining us on The Aging Boomers. Just be safe out there, and we'll talk to you all soon.